but it was done, at any rate, peaceably. So it is possible. 150 years ago, it was not handled so very well, and it came at a time when the centralizing industrial forces of the north of this country would not allow the decentralism that a southern secession would bring about. And so the powers that be made up this idea that union was indissoluble, an idea that had never been heard of before 1861. Until Lincoln and his pals made up this idea that you couldn't divide the Union, that had been an understood principle. So much understood that it wasn't even spelled out in the Constitution. They lived with that Constitution with the idea that a state could join, a state could leave. It was just understood. There's no word about secession in the Constitution, therefore it cannot be unconstitutional. And then the reason it's not mentioned there is that that was the assumption before certain economic interests in the North decided that they had to make up the idea that the Union could not be dissolved, and hence were willing to sacrifice, 900,000 lives of young men in order to make sure that it would not be dissolved. But we see from our history that it is not a strange thing in our history, and therefore it is something that is completely American. And on an international scale, we've also seen secession, particularly in the last few years, but in fact since 1945, most of the nations of the world have been created by secession. This seems to be a natural process going on around the world, and going on still. And it has taken hold here in this country as well. And as a scholar who has studied these things has said to me, there's more talk about secession today than at any time since 1865. People are beginning to look at that idea and say they don't see any other way out. No other way to address not merely the environmental, but the economic and political and social problems that are tearing this country apart and making the government incapable of acting within it. It will be an idea that will take some time to shed the terrible image that the war of 150 years ago has given it. But once you shred it of that particular example of secession and take it back to other successful secessions and just look at it, it becomes a conceivable solution. And so I just ask you to think about that, to think on those lines, to think about what Katua is and what Katua would be, and to think of your bioregion as your nation. If you want freedom and democracy and true empowerment as citizens, if you want ecological health and a living environment for yourselves and your children, think of your home as your bioregion, and your bioregion as your nation, the Democratic Republic of Katua. answer questions you may have on that or any allied subjects. Sir?
I'm fascinated with the notion that community is defined by a group of 500, and since we are in our bioregional organized and often in much larger collections of people than that, how would a city like Asheville come again into this manageable, some association or confederation of neighborhoods that were 500 people? How would we manage that?
Well, block organizations, block associations are a common means of doing that. And were considerably more popular maybe 30 years ago than I guess they are now. But that's an easy way of organizing. Facing houses on a street, a block of a street. A fellow named Ronald Reagan thought that block associations were an excellent way to decentralize power, and he was going to go into office and pare down government, as you will recall. And he invited into the White House several people whose job was to promote things like block associations and small developments that would begin to get political and eventually taxing power so as to get decentralization down to the lowest possible level. And he gave a couple of speeches about this. And a friend of mine went into the White House to work on this. And he discovered that as soon as he took the oath of office, Reagan wanted nothing anymore to do with that idea. And he proceeded to set about making the government far bigger than it had been before he came in. And he gave himself over to all of those forces that want to centralize power, want to have everything in Washington so they can control it. And this is why corporations are always in favor of regulations. Because if they get regulations, that's a unified rule from Washington. And then they can go about buying the lawmakers so as to make those regulations exactly the way they want them to be. The centralizers are very happy, and the corporate interests are very happy with the centralizers. And as a result of that, the block association movement, I think, has withered considerably, but it is still at least a way of thinking of that. There's another way of going about this, which would be to have the city considering devolving powers to school districts and devolving economic power to school districts as well, because that's an existing entity that we could understand, and it has it has one power already, and it's possible to imagine it considering other things. In the same way that Congress in 200 years has made the Commerce Clause fit anything that it wants, so that the federal government can put its nose into anything at all that goes on under the Commerce Clause. In that same way, a school district could argue that there were a lot of things that were educational or affected education,